Thank you very much, Francisco, and thanks to you, the Hardy Group, who, after a very full and strenuous day, after alcohol and after food, including dessert that had sugar in it, maybe that's why you're here, you showed up this evening, so thank you for doing that. This was my subtitle. The main title, as you've seen from the program, is something like Outrageous and Unusual and Exceptional Memories, and I will have something to say about that, but I have to build a case before that for why we should look for those. So let me begin, and I'm going to begin with a quote from a book that was published recently by a faculty member here at UCI, a philosopher, who wrote a book entitled Memory. And he said, remembering is a fundamental cognitive process subserving virtually all other important cognitive functions. And I agree with that. Since without memory, one couldn't think. And I agree with that. Some philosophers go so far as to claim that memory is the mark of being human. And I disagree with that. And we should disagree with that because we've heard a lot today about the continuity. As a matter of fact, the worm C. elegans that has about 300 neurons, a little tiny worm that grovels around in the ground, learns and remembers. I mean, that's the level at which you see learning. And I don't know of an example of an animal that does not have the capability of learning and remembering. If you do, send me an email. Now, I'm going to give a few more quotes here to give a flavor of how people think about this. This is from a quote of a program, a theater program, of a play. You know how the people write about the play and all of that. And this is a play that had something to do with memory. And the person who wrote this said, "Our brains, remarkable as they are, could not begin to contain and give equal weight to our every moment of life." And we've already seen some of that. Memories are selective in part because our experiences are selective. That is, we don't attend to every moment of life, so why would we expect to remember it? For example, none of you were thinking about, paying attention to, or would remember, without my saying so, the pressure on your left foot that is created by the shoe on your left foot. And yet, that's an impression that you have, and yet that's not stored. That's not something you're going to go home and say, boy, I can hardly wait to tell you about the pressure on my left foot. While this lecture, maybe you will. I don't know. Here's another one. I'm going back in time now to William James. And this is leading in then to what I'm going to talk about. Let me go back to this one. It says, our brains can't contain and give equal weight to every moment of life. And William James asked before that, in 1890, of some experiences, no memory survives the instance of their passage. Others may be recalled as long as life endures. How can we explain these differences? Francis Bacon, before him, said, memory is assisted by anything that makes an impression on a powerful passion, inspiring fear, for example, or wonder, shame, or joy. So we're moving from saying, well, not everything can be learned, to say, well, some things are learned and remembered, and some are not learned and remembered. And then Francis Bacon, long before, gave a clue. He said a passion can assist the formation of memory. Descartes said something which is very similar to that. The usefulness of all of the passions, he said, consists in their strengthening and prolonging in the soul thoughts which are good for it to conserve. So not only do we not remember everything, we selectively remember some things. We remember things that are powerfully emotion eliciting. And then Descartes gives a function here. The usefulness, the function of all of the passion consists in their strengthening thoughts which are good for it to conserve. So here we now have a functional purpose of memory, which goes back to the first quote that stated that memory is an enormously important capacity, and without it, nobody would be here today. As a matter of fact, without it, nobody would be, in my opinion. So that's how important it is. Now, this was recognized by Gary Larson in a little cartoon. I don't know if you can read it. All these forest animals. This is my evolutionary slide, by the way. I'm waiting for a little laughter on that. Gary Larson wrote, "More facts of nature. All forest animals to this very day remember exactly where they were and what they were doing when they heard that Bambi's mother had been shot." Now, the reason that this is funny is because we all know that we either have or think we have very strong memories of very strong emotional experiences. We remember the death of a person. We remember an earthquake. Remember all of these very powerful things. This has been referred to in the literature as flashbulb memory. That's in the days when there were flashbulbs. So a flash goes off and the strong memory is made. Well, there's a lot of evidence for that, which I will not review for you here, but I'll give a couple of examples. Going back to the most recent time, at the time of 9/11, a few months later, individuals who were close to the Twin Towers going down had very strong memory of all the details surrounding that. People who lived and worked in Midtown Manhattan had fewer memories and less strong memories of that. So just the distance from the site of the incidents made a difference in how well things were remembered. Or another example was the big San Francisco earthquake, which you will find out later exactly when it was. I can never remember. But people who lived near the earthquake had very strong, detailed, and accurate memories of the circumstances of the earthquake a year later, whereas people who lived in Atlanta, Georgia, who learned about it, had much weaker memories about the earthquake. Those either just, some have been strong studies, other have been anecdotal reports that support the idea that Gary Larson here has captured in his cartoon. Now, why does that happen? Why is it that that emotional experience will create strong memories? And that's what I want to talk about first. But in order to do it, I have to give you the background that was mentioned a little bit in talking about the hippocampus, but I'll draw it out a little bit. This is a curve of retrograde amnesia, which is based on literally dozens, if not hundreds of studies in rats, starting first with humans and then with rats, in which animals are trained on a task and given a treatment immediately after training or at some later period of time, and then tested a day later, a week later, a month later, something of that kind. The closer in time this treatment comes to the time of the learning, the more amnesia there will be. And this was really originally discovered with electroconvulsive shock, but it's been found with lots of things. So this is a very reliable curve of retrograde amnesia. Many years ago, when I first became acquainted with this, I was actually a graduate student, I said, well, if that's the case, what this says, it supports an old view originally proposed in 1900 by two German psychologists, Müller and Pilziker, who said that memories are not formed instantly, but when an experience occurs, the process of memory starts, and the underlying processes continue and consolidate over time, so that memory consolidation takes time over learning. And that's what this reflects. So I said, if that's the case, I should be able to use a very mild treatment which would activate the brain rather than impair it, and maybe get enhancement. And that's exactly what I got in quite a few experiments. A treatment of a stimulant drug, and I've listed some of them here, given to animals immediately after training, enhanced their memory as tested later on. And if the treatment was delayed, let's say by an hour or something of that kind, it had less effect. So retrograde amnesia and retrograde enhancement are readily obtained in the laboratory. Now, after doing these experiments for too many years, we began to think about why it was that we were able to do this anyway. Why is it that we were able to tickle the brain with a little bit of a stimulant after training and get enhanced memory? Or beyond that, the question is, why is it that memories consolidate slowly anyway? I mean, I thought if I had the power to make a brain, I'd make a brain that made a strong memory instantly. I mean, that makes a lot of sense. You have an experience, and you have the impression that you're making a strong memory instantly, but you're not. But wouldn't that be nice to have? And we thought about it, and we said, well, maybe the reason for that is that since memory consolidates slowly, that might provide an opportunity for things that happen after memory to regulate the strength, much as had been suggested by the philosophers that I just read to you, including Descartes. A strong emotion, the consequences of emotion occur after a brief event, not before the event. So, what happens when you have a strong emotional experience? And it doesn't have to be strong either. You can be, somebody can say something nice about you, or you can be insulted, or you can fall down, or you can have an automobile accident, or you can be mugged, you can be robbed, or you can be in a place where guns are going off. All of those things can happen. Even at the mildest level, when there's arousal of any kind, there are two pathways that take place. One is that leads to the secretion of cortisol in humans, or cortisone in the rat and mouse. And the other side is a pathway that leads to the release of epinephrine or adrenaline. Those things happen whether you like it or not. If I were to insult you now, unexpectedly, you would turn red. You have no control over that because the epinephrine would do that automatically. And I have done that on occasion just to illustrate the point, I'm embarrassed to say. So we decided to look at this in the laboratory, and this was a long time ago. So this is the little task that we used to begin with. We called it one trial inhibitory avoidance. It's very simple. A rat is placed here. The rat walks into this region that it has never seen before. It gets a mild electric shock to its feet, and we take it out. That's the learning. That's all there is to it. Then the next day or 2 days later or a month later, whenever we choose, we put the animal back in and ask, would you like to go back or you receive the shock? And generally they don't, and they will stay out for a minute or 2 minutes, 10 minutes, depending upon what happened to them, the level of the shock, and what else I'm going to show you. So that's the experiment, and here is an experiment in which we now, the first experiment of this kind, to examine the effect of adrenaline or epinephrine administered at a time that the animal would ordinarily release it to itself, but we gave it a dose such that it would be a higher level than the animal released to itself. So here are controls. These are controls that are trained. The first day they went through in about 10 seconds. The next day it took them a minute to go back to the place where they received the shock. But animals just like this that got a dose of epinephrine immediately after training took them a long time to go back. This is enhanced memory of this training experience induced by a hormone which we ordinarily release to ourselves when we are aroused or stressed. So there's enhancement. Now what about the consolidation part? Remember that consolidation is time dependent, so this treatment should be less effective if given at a delayed period of time. And it is. If it's delayed by 2 hours, there's no effect at all. Now, this is the pattern that is induced by the normal release of epinephrine. That is, when you get excited, the epinephrine is released then. It's not released 2 hours later. So this mimics the natural condition, and it shows that this effect, this enhanced memory of an experience, can be induced by a hormone which is ordinarily released by an arousing experience. And I'm not showing you this, but it is dose dependent. Now, at that time, we were also doing studies of electrical stimulation of the brain in various regions for quite different reasons. We were interested in the question of whether the memory effects of electrical stimulation of the brain, including electroconvulsive shock, were based on the seizure activity induced or something else. And in the course of this, we found that we could enhance memory in rats by stimulating the amygdala of rats with a little bit of electrical stimulation and get the same results that we got with the drugs and with epinephrine. And for those of you who are not conoscente, here is where the amygdala is, right on the tip of the hippocampus, and it was one of the regions that, as was pointed out earlier, that was removed when HM had the now famous surgery. The amygdala went out with the anterior hippocampus. So that's it, and we aimed our experiment at that. This is a longitudinal section of a rat brain, and this shows that we put a cannula down into a specific region of the amygdala called the basolateral region so that we could manipulate what was going on there. So this was a jump from the peripheral administration of epinephrine to the brain, and you'll see why that is important with this. So we repeated the experiment that we had done previously. Here, animals, control animals, were trained on one day, tested the next day. Under these conditions, they stayed out for 2 minutes. Here is a replication of the epinephrine effect. These animals got a good dose of epinephrine immediately after training, and this is very significant enhancement of memory. Now what we did was to put into the amygdala a drug which blocks the action of both epinephrine and the transmitter, or the neuromodulator in the brain, which is norepinephrine. We put in a drug, which most of you know about. It's a beta blocker, propranolol. Propranolol is a beta blocker, an adrenergic receptor antagonist. So we put that into controls in a very low dose, and it didn't do anything, very low dose, but it blocked the effect of epinephrine. So for us, back in 1986, this is what we call a bingo experiment, because this then launched a whole series of studies because we were in the amygdala. We think we had identified a brain region that epinephrine acted on in order to influence memory. In collateral experiments, some of my graduate students and postdocs did experiments in which they stimulated the ascending vagus nerve. And the reason they did that is because there is good evidence that the way that epinephrine influences brain activity is by binding to adrenergic receptors located on the ascending vagus nerve, and the activation is neuronally communicated to the brainstem. So it turns out that stimulating the vagus nerve does the same thing as epinephrine does, because it's working on the same receptors. But that's how it gets into the brain. So this launched things. Now, an implication of this then, if we were able to block the effect by putting a blocker in there, then putting the ordinary neurotransmitter, neuromodulator that lives in there ought to do the job. And so we did experiments in which we administered immediately after training to animals, we administered norepinephrine directly into the amygdala after training. And if you look up here, this is the latency of the animals to go back where they had received the shock. Actually, in this experiment, we didn't even let them walk in. We just placed them in and gave a shock. And then for the test, we put them in an adjacent alley and said, be our guest. Go back to where you received the shock. Would you like to do that? And if they're controls, and these are animals that had received immediately after the training different doses of norepinephrine, and these are controls that got norepinephrine but didn't receive any shock. So this is enhancement, and these are different measures. This used freezing as a measure, and this is pure latency here. So this says that putting the neuromodulator that is within the basolateral amygdala, putting it in there in additional amounts will cause enhanced memory if it's put in immediately after training. Now, the amygdala is promiscuous. I know there is a strong belief, and even in one of the slides earlier today, you saw that the amygdala was associated with fear. The reason it's associated with fear is that most people do experiments that measure fear. But the amygdala does not care what has been learned. If it is activated shortly after training, it will enhance memory of anything that it has learned. So I'll give you a couple of examples. The one I just showed you was fear learning. Now I'm going to show you extinction. These are animals who were trained in that task, and now they're put back in with no shock, given an opportunity to learn that this is now a safe place. Immediately after they had an opportunity to learn that it was safe, we injected them in the basolateral amygdala with a little bit of norepinephrine. And what we got was enhanced memory that it is now safe. So we could use norepinephrine to teach animals to remember that a place is bad and we can put it in there, and they will learn that a place is good. And these are controls. Now, the last experiment of this kind that we did was one that you should also be familiar with, because this kind of thing has been talked about before in here, and that's simple object recognition. In this case, there is no reward, there is no punishment, there's no conditioning, there's no extinction. Animals are just put in a box, and there are two identical objects, in this case, two light bulbs. That's it, and they're in there for 3 minutes. Then they're put in the next day with, or 2 days later in our experiments, with one of the same and a different object. And the question is, which one do they spend time examining? And the answer is they spend time examining this if they remember it. So in this experiment, we arranged the conditions so that the training over here was so weak that although we thought they were learning something, they wouldn't display it because we wanted to enhance the memory. And that's what we did. These are the saline controls. These animals got norepinephrine in the basolateral amygdala immediately after they were exposed to the objects. And here you see a dose response. It's always impairment at a very high dose. These animals over here were given more training. They were put in for 10 minutes to explore on the first day. So they had very good memory of what they had seen. But if we gave them propranolol into the basolateral amygdala after training, we could completely block the memory. So it doesn't make any difference what we ask the animals to learn and remember. That's unimportant. What is important is the activation of the stress system and the release of stress-related neuromodulators in the basolateral amygdala, in particular norepinephrine. Now, just very briefly, corticosterone or cortisol, that's the other stress hormone that is released, and all I want to say is that the same effects are obtained. Their effects are also mediated by the basolateral amygdala, and they require noradrenergic activation of the amygdala. So in order for cortisol or corticosterone to enhance memory, there has first to be noradrenergic activation of the amygdala, and then it does its job. And I'll show you just one brief experiment. Here's once again the novel object recognition. These animals received post-training cortisol just injected systemically. And here you see a dose-dependent enhancement of memory as tested the day after they received the injection. These animals I'm going to show you right here received propranolol in the basolateral amygdala and cortisol, and it was blocked. So the cortisol effect on memory is completely blocked by shutting off the noradrenergic receptors in this very specific brain region. So here is a cartoon summary of what we found in these and a whole lot of other experiments. We have the adrenal medulla that secretes epinephrine into the bloodstream, the adrenal cortex, which supplies cortisol or corticosterone. These are released. Epinephrine activates the ascending vagus nerve, and it goes to the brainstem, where it then releases norepinephrine into the forebrain of us and animals. And I'm not showing this, but these are the release of norepinephrine is also gated by GABA and by opioids. We worked that out as well. And also by acetylcholine on the downstream from that. Cortisol is released, corticosterone in the rat, and it can go any place. So this we worked out in a large number of experiments, and this is the, if you like, the wiring diagram of what happens when there is emotional activation and the release of these two stress hormones, and ultimately there's an activation of projections to other brain regions, which is modulated in the last step by acetylcholine. So we have experiments for each of these steps along in here, and that will be on the midterm. All right, now there's a further implication. So far this has been pharmacology, but the basic underlying implication is that when animals get excited, they not only release the stress hormones from the adrenal gland, but also they must release norepinephrine within the amygdala. all of the experiments that I've just described would not have worked were this not the case. So we said we have to measure it. So we did. So we used high-performance liquid chromatography, and we implanted probes down into the brains. We pumped a solution in, and the solution goes here. Then we drew the solution out, and that went for analysis of norepinephrine. And here are some of the results we obtained. These are animals that we're measuring the norepinephrine release, and this is baseline, like this. And at this point, they get training. They get a little foot shock in the apparatus, and you can see that there's huge variation in the amount released. Here's one animal that had an 800% increase in the release of norepinephrine within the basolateral amygdala, and here's an animal that showed practically nothing, and we have animals all in between. If you look carefully, you can see these are the retention test scores 2 days later of these same animals. This animal that had 800% increase never went back in where it had been shocked. Stayed out for 10 minutes, and I call that my graduate student postdoc boredom threshold, because they have to sit and watch an animal do nothing for 10 minutes in order to get the measure. Here's another animal that had about a 500% increase, never went back. Let's go down here. This one in red had virtually no increase. It walked in again in 10 seconds. And what you see here is a relationship between the amount of norepinephrine that was released by the animals after the training and their retention 2 days later. And this is the best predictor that I know of for this kind of memory. Now, the amygdala, anatomical studies have shown that the amygdala is more richly connected with other regions of the brain than any other region of the brain is interconnected with other regions. It's just massively interconnected. So what we've done in a lot of experiments is to look at the relationship between the basolateral amygdala and other regions that are candidate regions for memory processing, including the hippocampus that you've heard a lot about, the caudate nucleus that you've heard something about, nucleus accumbens, entorhinal cortex, we didn't talk about this, but nucleus basalis and others. And we've asked about the interactions of the amygdala with these other regions in influencing memory, and I'll tell you a little bit about it. So here is an experiment that tries to parse this. First of all, let me tell you that if you take a rat and drop it in an apparatus and give it a shock and take it right out, and then test it later, it will show no evidence of memory. It needs some time. You have to put the animal in and leave it for a while and give it a shock, and then you'll show evidence of retention. But just dropping it in will show no evidence at all. Now, so the animal learns two things. The animal learns that it gets a shock, and it learns, if you allow it, that it gets a shock in a place. Learns at least those two. It learns the white coats are bad. Also, that's the third thing that it learns. All right, so what we did, following this, we borrowed this methodology from other investigators. So what we did was on one day, we would put the animal in the box for a period of time so it could learn the context. And then later, on the next day, we would put it in and give it a foot shock, which by itself would be insufficient to induce memory, right? So we give it, learn the context, and very quickly, and we are going to assume that the animal will put one together and get two. And in fact, that's what they do. But we wanted to see that the contribution of different brain regions to this. So let's run through it. On day one, the animals get an infusion in one of three brain regions. Day two, they get a foot shock and get an infusion into one of three brain regions. And then on day four, they get a retention test. And we want to see if there is a selective effect of stimulating a particular brain region. So let's look at this. If the animals are given an infusion, in this case we used a cholinergic agonist called oxytryptamine, but that's not important. If we infused it and the animals were put in the context and we stimulated the hippocampus, we got enhanced memory when the animals were tested later. If we injected into the hippocampus After the foot shock, we got no effect at all. So what this says is the animals get the context on one day, they get the foot shock on the next day, but if we infuse the hippocampus with a little stimulant on the first day, they did a better job of putting 2 and 2 together. Right? Now we can look at after foot shock. We worked with the rostral anterior cingulate region of the cortex because of extensive evidence suggesting that this is a region of the brain that is involved in sensing of pain. So we said, fine, let's use that and give them foot shock. So here's what we did. If we injected into the anterior cingulate after the context, it did nothing at all. But if we injected it after the foot shock, it gave enhancement of memory. So here you have a double dissociation. Injecting it into one region of the brain selectively enhances memory of the context, that's hippocampus. Put it in the other region of the brain, it selectively enhances memory of the foot shock, put together with a weaker memory they have of the context. So we also did it, as you might guess, with the amygdala. So the animals were given an amygdala injection after either the context or the foot shock, and the amygdala did both. The amygdala did not care what was being learned. When it was activated, it enhanced memory of the shock, or it enhanced memory of the context. Once again, evidence that is promiscuous and doesn't care about the information learned. Now, what about interactions further with other regions of the brain? We've heard a lot about the hippocampus, so we took a look at that. This is an experiment. First, I'll just show you the pharmacological results. Here animals that got a vehicle solution after one trial training and a shock. These animals got a drug which mimics the action of norepinephrine called clenbuterol immediately after training, and there's enhanced memory. These are controls that got more training so we could see amnesia, which was induced by shutting off the sodium pump within the amygdala with lidocaine. So here's memory enhancement induced by amygdala activation, memory impairment induced by shutting off the amygdala. Now what we did was to look at what's happening in the hippocampus with which the amygdala is connected. And here's what happened. The clenbuterol enhanced the expression of immediate early gene ARC in the hippocampus, and the lidocaine impaired the expression of the protein immediate early gene ARC. ARC is important because it is a immediate early gene that regulates neuroplasticity. And the implication of this is that one reason that infusing the amygdala with norepinephrine enhances memory is because it activates neuroregulatory systems in a region which is important for that, namely the hippocampus. And we did comparable experiments in other brain regions to check it out. Here's one additional experiment of this kind, which was done in collaboration with Dr. Weinberger here at UCI. And this was a study of the influence of the amygdala on learning in the cortex. So it's auditory learning in the cortex, and if you run a bunch of tones to give to the animal a bunch of tones, the animals will have a preference. The cortex of the animal will have a specific preference for one of those tones. Then what we did was to give another tone and pair that other tone with stimulation of the amygdala. And as you see, there was the original preference. These are all the frequencies here. That was the best frequency. After the pairing with this frequency with the amygdala, it shifted over here. There's no more stimulation, but increased over a period of 75 minutes. The shift continued to occur after the training stopped. So that says the cortical representation of sounds can be altered by basolateral amygdala stimulation. You turn off the stimulation once you've initiated the process, and the consolidation can be measured over a period of time. You actually see the shift in the preference of the cortex for this new tone which has been induced. Now, just briefly, this is all animals, and what about humans? So I'll tell you just a couple of experiments. Here's one done by Siegel in Larry Cahill's laboratory here at Irvine. in which they showed human subjects emotional material, and immediately after that, they measured in the saliva alpha amylase, which provides an index of norepinephrine release. And what you see here are individual subjects showing an increase in this alpha amylase after training in relation to the memory 1 week later, and the correlation is significant. So that's one type of experiment. We have very few volunteers to have cannulas put in their heads, so we have to look for other ways of investigating this. Here's another one. This is an old one using PET imaging, in which subjects were injected with radio-labeled glucose and then shown a series of pretty nasty film clips for about half an hour while the glucose was being taken up into the brain. The brain was scanned using PET. We said goodbye to the subjects, and 3 weeks later they get a surprise memory test, and this is a relationship on individual subjects between their memory of the films 3 weeks later and the activation of the right amygdala as determined by PET imaging. And that says that if you only know the glucose levels, that will enable you to predict pretty well how the subject will remember at a later time. So here is another cartoon that will tell you how I look at this. We have a learning experience, and we have a basolateral amygdala, and we have a bunch of brain regions. Some of them are listed here. And when there is a learning experience, there will be the initiation of memory consolidation no matter what. I mean, even when you are not very excited, you learn something, but also the adrenal gland is going to get activated and the amygdala is going to get activated. And when they get activated, then you have the modulatory influences. Here's where the memory processing is occurring here, and these are the booster systems. In effect, they say to these other brain regions, something important happened, I think you better make a stronger memory of that. And that's the way we look at this modulatory influence of the amygdala. Now, I've been interested, as you can tell, for many years in the brain conditions that make strong memory, that make lasting memories. And I had a young woman contact me in late spring in 2000, sent me an email and said that she'd like to meet with me because she had a memory problem. And I said, well, this is not a clinic. If you tell me what your problem is, maybe I can direct you to a memory clinic. And she said, no, my problem is that I don't forget. So I said, well, when can we meet? And so she came to see me. And this is part of the message that she wrote to me. It was a long message. She said, I'm 34 years old and have had this unbelievable ability to recall my past. I can take a date between 1974 and today and tell you what day it falls on, what I was doing that day, and if anything of great importance occurred on that day, I can describe it to you as well. So I invited her into the laboratory, and I began to test her by testing her for public events, and those are all available in books. So I would ask her what happened on June 17th, 1978, if there was a big plane crash or there was a well-known murder, or if there were something of significance that would have made it to CNN or a newspaper so that I could check that it actually happened on that date. And I did this with a large number of questions, and each time she would just blithely tell me the date and the day of the event and what she was doing on that day over a range of years and over a range of topics. And just in a casual voice, oh yes, I remember I was with my boyfriend that day, I had lunch and the news came on over the radio, oh yes, And on one occasion, I asked her what happened in 1979 on a particular date, and she said nothing. And I said, well, it was pretty important. I give a little clue like that, like it's important. And then she said, I still don't know. I said, well, think international. Those are the kind of clues I would give, very rarely, by the way. And she said, well, I can't think of anything, but 3 days earlier, the Iranians took over our embassy. And I said, well, you got it right, but you got the wrong day. And she said, no. And I said, well, that's what the book says. And she says blithely, the book is wrong. And the book was wrong. Now, the thing of it is, and I'm going to show you some of these subjects, is that they don't do what you and I do. We now have more subjects. They don't do what you and I do when asked a very difficult question. We look at the sky, our eyeballs roll up, and we say, let me see, I think, stall. No, it just comes out like this, very blithely. You'll see it. It just, without any difficulty, there's no stress at all, and it is interesting and puzzling. So let me show you a little bit of this. Here is Jill Price.
The first person ever identified with this ability is Jill Price, who says she feels haunted by the never-ending stream of memories and hasn't wanted to meet any of the...
With the publicity that we received from the work with Jill Price, we published a paper. She wrote a book. She was on Good Morning America. We were on National Public Radio talking about this. We had a large number of people who contacted us, and by large, let's say maybe 50 or 60 people, and we got 5 additional subjects. So on December 19th, in 2009, we were, I'm going to get it right because I have this kind of memory. 2009, we were filmed by PBS for a 60-minute program. And then on January 19th, 2010, it aired. And I know that it was a Sunday. And the reason I know it was a Sunday because 60 Minutes is always on a Sunday. But you will see that these people can give these answers without having that kind of a crutch, and I'm going to show you a little bit of it. So here's 5 new subjects that we got.
A 7.1 earthquake hit the San Francisco-Oakland area on
October 17th, 1989.
Tuesday.
I remember we were watching the game of the World Series. It was like,
Right.
oh my gosh.
Right.
Are you guys
That was
feeling
terrible.
a little competitive with each other?
Now that will illustrate, they had no idea what they were going to be asked, and that'll just show you how quickly they responded and how competitive they were, by the way. They all just said, yeah, they all knew, and they added on that they were at a baseball game and everything. It's not just semantic knowledge. It was that date and that day, but it's embedded in what was going on in that day. It's a very rich kind of a thing. So now I'm going to talk with the young woman who's in the middle here. She is a very high-level professional violinist in New York City, and we've now tested her quite a bit, and I'm going to let you see what she says here.
McGaugh says this type of memory is completely new to science, so he and his colleagues have had to devise their own tests, like this one on public events.
October 19th, 1987.
It was a Monday. That was the day of the big stock market crash, and the cellist Jacqueline Dupre died that day.
The Berlin Wall falls on what day?
November 9th, 1989, which was a Thursday.
Christopher Reeve's accident occurred on what day?
It was Saturday, May 27th, 1995.
And when were the Oscars held in 1999?
In 1999, Sunday, March 21st.
Yes, perfect.
So you get an idea of the range of questions it asked, cover a wide range, and she just blithely gave the answer. And if what you don't know is in interrogation, she would say, oh yes, and I made truffles that day, and oh, I went down to the park and walked and all of that. On one occasion when she was here, she brought she's a professional, so she brought all of her daily date books. That is what she does, you know, all of the appointments she has throughout the day. She had a big box like that. And I poured those on a table in our conference room, and there were about 6 or 8 postdocs and advanced graduate students sitting around the table. Each one of them took one of her yearbooks and opened to a random spot in it and said, what did you do on this day, and gave her the date. And she gave the day, and then she went through the day and said all the things she did in a narrative, the way you would describe what you did yesterday, and she was errorless in the questioning by all of these students. Now I'm going to show, let me start over. One of the concerns, and actually criticisms about this, is that perhaps what these people do is just rehearse a lot. We know that we can make memory strong by rehearsal. So what they do is they sit around and they just rehearse and rehearse and rehearse. Louise Owen sat around all the time rehearsing on the offside chance that I might ask her about when the stock market closed and all of the questions I just asked her. She got to be prepared all the time because Jim McGaugh is going to interrogate her. That's one possibility. Another possibility is that they don't do that, they just happen to remember. So in the next series I'm going to show you here, I ask her questions about which there would very likely have been any rehearsal. That is, it's inconceivable to me that anyone would sit around rehearsing this kind of information. Oh, that's not quite
She
there.
says she can remember every day of her life since the age of 11.
Try to talk us through, can you do that? How it works, out of the air.
April 21st, 1991.
1991, okay, April 21st. So in the moment between April 21st and 1991, I have scrolled through 25 April 21sts thinking, which one is it going to be? Which one is it going to be? Okay, 1991, which was a Sunday, and I was in Los Angeles, and I had a concert with the American Youth.
So that's what she does. They describe it as being like a Google search, or the older ones like a Rolodex search. It just goes like this. And they use this expression a lot, that they just look out here, and there it is. Now the little bit I was describing. Testing for dates for which she was unlikely to have rehearsed.
Let's move back in time now to 1990. It rained on several days in January and February. Can you name the dates on which it rained?
Believe it or not, she could.
Let's see. It was slightly rainy and cloudy on January 14th, 15th. It was very hot the weekend of the 27th, 28th. No rain.
We checked the official weather records,
It rained very hard on Sunday, February 4th.
and she was right.
That was 19 years ago, and she was able to say the days on which it rained in New York. Now, I'm going to show you another one. This is a TV producer in Los Angeles who has produced, any of you ever watch Ice Truckers? None of you? Any of you ever watch the fishing off the coast of Alaska? He produces those kind of action things. Very interesting guy. And he's also a sports nut, and you'll see that.
Remembers every game.
When was the last time the Redskins beat the Steelers?
Let's see, they played them in 2004, and the Steelers won. They played them in 2000, the Steelers...
We sat there as he scanned back through 19 seasons in 19 seconds.
Oh, in 91. Yeah, they played in 91, November 17th, 1991.
He's an expert in sports, but he's also an expert in remembering everything else. And one day, he decided that he would memorialize his experience. So he wrote a book for himself called The Book of Bob. And what he did was to sit down and say, what was the best year I ever had for January 1st? And so he put that down. Let me see that. That was 1973. That was my January 1st. What was the best year I ever had for January 2nd? And he did that for 365 days, and he's got a fat book like that, which I hope he doesn't publish because some of it is rather obscene. But he did it. I mean, that's the Book of Bob. He's a very interesting guy. Now, here is another one of our subjects, Mary Lou Henner, who is a Hollywood actress. And many years ago, she was a star in a TV series called Taxi. Any of you ever heard of Taxi? Well, she was the redhead that starred in that. And she has this ability, and I'll just show you one clip of her.
Searched for footage of long ago events in Mary Lou's life to try and stump her.
October 26th, 1976.
Okay, October 26th,
1976.
was a Tuesday. Oh, I went to shoot a Ring Around the Collar commercial in Venice, Italy, and you saw a 2.5 mood shot of Venice, and then a gondolier singing, "Of love I sing, tra-la-la-la, for you got ring around the collar." And I went, my powder didn't work.
Of love I sing, la-la-la-la.
More than 30 years later,
Around the collar.
My powder didn't work.
dead.
Those are some of the examples. Now let me say something about the kind of memory that's involved here. We call it autobiographical memory because it does refer to things that they have experienced in the past. We don't call it episodic memory because it probably is a mixture of episodic memory and semantic knowledge. That is, some of these things they've probably thought about. I'm sure that Mary Lou Henner has thought about the recording in Italy a number of times, and maybe she somaticized that in addition to having an episodic memory. We just don't know. But what we do know is that when these people are tested on public events, or if they're tested on private events that we can verify by virtue of diaries or date books or things of this kind, they are remarkably accurate, just absolutely remarkably accurate. We have, after that 60-minute program that was on the 19th of December, I got about 600 emails from people who claimed that they had the same ability, and we tested all of them. We continue to get, I get about 3 a week still of people who claim that. And what you're seeing here is the distribution of scores on a 30-section, a 30-item quiz for both controls of same age and same sex as our other subjects. And I'm going to have to run through it with you. These orange here, or brown, are our controls. This is the percent correct on a 30-question quiz, and it ranges at the highest level about 30%, and the lowest level 0. Those are our controls. The whites are the people who claim that they had the ability, and it starts over here with people who are substantially worse than controls. These are the dopes over here. I don't know why they contacted me. And then they're just like our controls. They're just like our controls. They're people who think they have this ability but don't. But look at this. Another distribution starts over here, way beyond. It's not that there's one distribution and the tails are better. There's 2 distributions here. And if you look over here, these are the superstars, and we have worked more with these superstars, both in terms of testing and in terms of assessing things about them and about their brains. So let's take a look. We have done structural imaging of the brains of all of our 11 of our best subjects and compared them with controls that are age and sex matched. And we found differences in 9 regions of the brain. The one that interests me most is the uncinate fasciculus, which is a fiber pathway that connects the medial temporal lobe up with the frontal lobes. And DTI measures indicate or suggest that this is a more active fiber pathway in our subjects than in the controls. We also have a parahippocampal gyrus, which is larger in our subjects. And we have a larger lentiform nucleus in the striatum, including the caudate nucleus, which is larger. And some of the other regions are differences in shape. As I said, there are 9 altogether, but these are the ones in which I'm most interested. And the reason is that every one of these has been identified by other investigators in measuring autobiographical memory in normal subjects as being important. So that's why we are focusing on these, and we will have to learn more about that. Now, we are continuing those studies, but also we have recently published a paper in which we said it's time to say what we know about it, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about it. Our subjects, these and more subjects that I haven't shown you here. First, just to repeat, they are highly accurate in autobiographical remembering. There's no question about that, and that's true both for public events as well as for their own personal experiences. They are not exceptional learners. That is, in the laboratory, for laboratory tests, paired associates and digit span and things of that kind, sometimes they're a little bit better, but they're not significantly better, and on average, they're just no better. They are no better than you and I are about remembering yesterday. Their memories of yesterday are no better than ours. Their memory of 3 weeks ago is better than ours. Their memory of 6 months ago is highly better than ours. So what they are not fantastic learners, they are very poor forgetters. Whatever they learn, they simply have trouble forgetting. And that maps onto the earlier part of my talk, looking at the induction of strong memories, and we need to know whether the animal and human work that I cited previously maps onto this in some way. I've told you that there are differences, some differences in brain regions. The other thing I didn't tell you is that most, if not all of them, I believe it's all of them, have some degree of obsessive compulsiveness. And this may relate to the caudate differences because caudate nucleus has been shown to be involved in obsessive compulsiveness. Now, I have to be careful how I say this because I'm not a psychiatrist. We didn't diagnose, but I can give you some examples which will tell you why I think they sort of go in that direction. Marilu Henner has a closet of probably 200 pairs of shoes. Each one is set up in a way so the toe is in one direction, the heel is in the other, and they are all organized on the date of purchase and date last worn, all lined up. And the same is true of all of her clothes are organized that way. And as a hobby, she organizes the closets of her friends. She walked into my office on the first visit, and I think my office, as an academic, it's reasonably organized. I know where the papers are under a stack. You know how that is. She walked in, the first thing she said was, I could organize this office in 15 minutes. I mean, that was before we discussed memory. The producer of Ice Truckers and Fishing Off Alaska will not wear shoelaces because shoelaces touch the ground and there are germs on the ground. If he drops his keys, he has to wash them before he will insert them into a lock and so on. Another one of our subjects carries around napkins with him because when he goes places, he doesn't know who's touched things before, so he uses a napkin between his hand and the object so he can pick it up. So these are the little things that I am very much aware of. It takes a lot of work, by the way, to get them to confess this. So I become sort of the counselor, and I say at the end of our interview, now, we need to know some more about you. Can you tell us something about yourself, And they say, well, I've told you everything. Well, help us out. And they finally say, I don't like germs, or I don't like disorder, or whatever. So we know that they're all like that, and we haven't put that together in our thinking yet, and we will have to. Now, here's some questions that they raise. First is, what's the importance of selectivity in memory? William James says if you remember everything, it's the same as remembering nothing. Some of you may have read a Borges short story on Funes the Memorias, who got a head injury by falling off a horse, and then he could learn everything and never forget it. And he ended up, almost the last words in the short story, he says, my mind, sir, is like a garbage heap. A lot of stuff in there. What about selectivity in memory? These people remember all kinds of things that you and I would not remember over a long period of time. Although they do say, well, for public events, if it's important, I'll remember it. We don't know how much selectivity there is, so we need to do more of the experiments to examine that. Why is this ability so rare? We know that the 60-minute program was seen by 25 million people. We know that. And we know that she's written, one of them has written a book which has been read by more people, and so on. So that's a large number of people. Let's say if it's only 5% of the population of the United States that really has seen this, why is it that we only have so far 50 people? What is about it? Why is it that we don't have, we've not identified any family members who have this ability? Uncles, aunts, brothers, sisters, and so on. Why is this? We are doing genetic studies at the present time, and maybe within the next 6 months we'll have an answer to that, whether there is a genetic mutation that enables this to occur. The reason we think there might be is because one of my former postdocs did a study of the survivors of the Rwanda massacre who have a post-traumatic stress disorder, and these individuals have a mutation which is important, so we might find something there. And the last one is, what possible insights can we have concerning memory? As I said earlier today, perhaps the most important study ever in the history of memory research was that of HM, because that changed the thinking and the methodology, the approach. It changed everything. There's a before 1957 and there's an after 1957, and it came being stimulated by the finding, one clinical finding with one subject. Very powerful finding. We hope that maybe, as we learn more about this, we will gain some insights into the nature of learning and memory that we don't now have. We may learn something about what the brain is able to do that we don't know about. And so that's what pushes us forward on that. This is a list of a few of the people who've worked with me on this research, and I'm indebted to them for that. And with that, thank you very much.